Bias blind spot. The bias blind spot refers to the tendency to believe that oneself is less susceptible to cognitive biases compared to others. Gambler's fallacy. The gambler's fallacy occurs when individuals mistakenly believe that past events influence future probabilities despite them remaining unchanged. Omission bias. Omission bias is the inclination to perceive harmful actions as worse or less ethical than equally harmful inactions. Proportionality. Proportionality bias is the natural tendency to assume that significant events must have significant causes, which may also explain why people are prone to accepting conspiracy theories. Moral credential effect. The moral credential effect arises when individuals allow themselves to behave less ethically after performing a good deed. Self-serving bias. Self-serving bias is the tendency to attribute successes to personal abilities and failures to external factors. Framing effect. The framing effect is the tendency to interpret identical information differently depending on its presentation. This includes the contrast effect, where the perception of a stimulus is influenced by a recently observed contrasting object. Actor-observer bias. Actor-observer bias is the tendency to attribute others' actions to their character, while attributing one's own actions to situational factors. Picture superiority effect. The picture superiority effect suggests that concepts learned through images are more easily and frequently recalled than those learned through written words. Outcome bias. Outcome bias is the tendency to evaluate a decision based on its result rather than the quality of the decision at the time it was made. Mere exposure effect. The mere exposure effect is a psychological phenomenon where repeated exposure to something leads to a preference for it. Hard-easy effect. The hard-easy effect is the tendency to overestimate one's ability to complete difficult tasks and underestimate the ease of simpler tasks. Survivorship bias. Survivorship bias occurs when focusing only on successful individuals or items, ignoring those that failed due to their lack of visibility. Baader-Meinhof phenomenon. Also known as frequency illusion, this phenomenon happens when something newly noticed suddenly seems to appear more frequently. Availability heuristic. The availability heuristic is the tendency to overestimate the likelihood of events that are easily recalled, often due to recency or emotional impact. Dunning-Kruger effect. The Dunning-Kruger effect describes how unskilled individuals tend to overestimate their abilities, while experts may underestimate theirs. Halo effect. The halo effect is the tendency for a person's positive or negative traits to influence overall perception of their character. Pygmalion effect. The Pygmalion effect refers to how others' expectations can influence an individual's behavior in a self-fulfilling manner. Decoy effect. The decoy effect, commonly used in marketing, occurs when the introduction of a less attractive third option alters consumer preferences between two choices. Selection bias. Selection bias arises when the method of selecting individuals or data skews the results, preventing accurate representation of the population. Anchoring bias. Anchoring bias is the tendency to heavily rely on the first piece of information encountered when making decisions. Confirmation bias. Confirmation bias is the inclination to seek, interpret, and remember information that supports pre-existing beliefs. Overconfidence effect. The overconfidence effect refers to the excessive belief in one's own answers or decisions, often leading to mistakes. Egocentric bias. Egocentric bias is the tendency to rely too much on one's own perspective or to hold an inflated view of oneself. Information bias. Information bias involves seeking additional information even when it does not affect decision-making. Hindsight bias. Also known as the "I knew it all along" effect, hindsight bias is the tendency to view past events as more predictable than they were. Projection bias. Projection bias is the inclination to assume that future preferences and values will align with current ones, leading to suboptimal decisions. Apophenia. Apophenia is the tendency to perceive meaningful connections between unrelated phenomena. Serial position effect. The serial position effect is the tendency to remember the first and last items in a list better than the middle ones. Recency bias. Recency bias gives greater importance to the most recent events when evaluating information. Authority bias. Authority bias is the inclination to attribute greater accuracy to the opinions of authority figures regardless of content. Unit bias. Unit bias refers to the tendency to perceive a single unit of something as the appropriate amount to consume or use. Availability cascade. An availability cascade is a self-reinforcing process where repeated exposure to an idea makes it seem more credible. Bandwagon effect. The bandwagon effect is the tendency to adopt beliefs or behaviors because many others are doing so. Illusory truth effect. The illusory truth effect describes how repeated exposure to a statement increases its perceived truthfulness. Next-in-line effect. The next-in-line effect occurs when individuals have poorer recall for information presented immediately before their turn to speak. In-group bias. In-group bias is the tendency to favor members of one's own group over outsiders. Spotlight effect. The spotlight effect is the overestimation of how much others notice one's appearance or behavior. Choice supportive bias. Choice supportive bias is the tendency to remember chosen options as better than they actually were. Ostrich effect. The ostrich effect describes the avoidance of potentially negative information to reduce psychological discomfort. Selective perception bias. Selective perception bias is the tendency to ignore or forget information that contradicts existing beliefs. Peak-end rule. The peak-end rule suggests that people judge experiences based on their peak moment and how they end rather than the overall experience. If you liked the video, drop a like and subscribe to the channel. Also, you can activate the bell so that YouTube notifies you of my content. Thank you for the support.